Evan, handily identified by this name tag. You can find me on GitLab and on Matrix. Okay. Don't turn that on that close. Do that. Run away, run away. We tried. So you can find me on GitLab and Matrix under EWLSH, and then leading the second half of this talk will be the wonderful Philip Chimento. You can find him on most platforms as P. Tomato. We lovingly call him the JavaScript guru. Let's see. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to have a lot of different stuff to talk about, covering everything from using TypeScript to write GNOME apps, some exciting community-led documentation updates, what's new and what's next for JavaScript and GJS in 46 and 47, and a bunch of thank yous to everyone who's contributed to JavaScript in the past year and made it awesome. So just some general guidelines for the presentation. It's full of links, so if you want to click those links, don't come up here. Go to ptomato.name/talks/GUADEC 2024. I believe that's the year. And if you see little things like 46 circle, 47 circle, that's denoting what GNOME release the thing is available in, and the hat is just a big kudos to whoever did it. So let's start off with some exciting community updates. So you might be wondering, what is the state of TypeScript for GNOME? And if you're not wondering that, welcome. So earlier this year, we actually released the first beta of unified TypeScript definitions for GNOME. What this means, in essence, is that historically there's been a bunch of different community projects that have tried to bind TypeScript to G-object introspection and thus have beautiful, strongly typed JavaScript available. But they've all had their caveats, they've all had their issues. A lot of the projects peter out over time. And so the two largest projects, gi.ts and ts for gur, combined under the ts for gur namespace and combined all the cool stuff that each of them did into one beta binding. And Pascal is my wonderful co-contributor on that project, and he's been working tirelessly to fill in a bunch of feature gaps, which we'll talk about in a bit. And I've been doing some fun stuff like bug hunting. For instance, right now, the beta bindings don't support permissification. If you don't know what permissification is, we'll talk about it later. I want to give a big kudos to STF funding, though, because STF funding did push a lot of this over the finish line and introduce a great new language for GNOME. So if you're wondering how you can use TypeScript today, there's a bunch of different ways. The one I'll shout out immediately is Chris Davis, who's been working on an amazing TypeScript template for GJS. It has everything, batteries included. You can just get going, work on it, and have a great old time. And if you haven't used TypeScript before, I probably should have given an introduction to it, but I will now. TypeScript is a great language that sits on top of JavaScript and adds, as the name suggests, types. So you can do really cool things on top of JavaScript's functional programming styles and object-oriented programming styles to strongly type check JavaScript code and add a bunch of cool documentation and other things along those lines. And if you're like, oh, I don't want to switch my whole code base to a different language, well, guess what? You can even use the TypeScript compiler on JavaScript to lint for things like, incorrect variable assignments, incorrect variable names, mysterious bugs in the shell, lots of fun stuff. I would say most apps for GNOME should in general start with the TypeScript template, simply because it's set up to work with GNOME easily. If you're more experimental, like I am, let's talk about the beta bindings. So if you're currently developing a shell extension, or you're very adventurous, the beta bindings are currently published as NPM packages. If you don't know NPM, it's the node package something. And it's essentially a big ecosystem of JavaScript code and packages that are published there. It's also going to be published on some other repositories so you can access them without going through corporate NPM land. But in general, distro packaging with NPM packages is not very simple, and distro packagers don't love having to deal with them. So if you're building an app and you want to send it to the distros in the masses, maybe avoid the NPM packages for now and stick to the actual template, which includes all the TypeScript stuff in the repository itself. But if you're doing shell extensions or cool things like that, you can get started right now with some amazing TypeScript bindings. The link, if you go to the website, is clickable. And there's even a guide on gjs.guide, which we'll talk about later, that tells you how to write TypeScript for shell extensions. Right now, Pascal is working on a great new update that will actually allow the beta bindings to easily integrate with the GNOME template. We're expecting it in like a week or two. So the beta bindings will probably transition to stable in this cycle, and we'll have some amazing new TypeScript bindings. Maybe the shell will even see them soon. Hi, Florian. Some other really exciting community initiatives that have been happening in the last half are gjs.guide and the template, as I mentioned previously. The cool thing to note on this slide, though, is that they have a new home. So we now have a JavaScript organization on GitLab under World. So you can find gjs.guide, which is documentation for the language and the use of it, and also the TypeScript template there. And we expect more and more fun projects that are making JavaScript amazing to migrate there. So speaking of gjs.guide, let's talk about it a little. If you don't know what gjs.guide is, it's a documentation website for everything JavaScript and GNOME. It's actually the URL. So if you type in gjs.guide, you will go to the website. So this year we did update it to a newer stack. So it has better search, better navigation. It works better on mobile. It has a dark theme, which had a few glitches, but we've mostly ironed them out, and lots of other great, technical improvements to make it easier to work with. I'd also want to give a huge shout out to all the amazing people who've been writing documentation on the site to make JavaScript easier to use and easier to learn about in GNOME. We have a great documentation that was written by Andy and Javad on extensions, the shell, and GNOME 46. Andy's been working hard on dbus documentation, and also Nitin, who is, I believe, a relatively new contributor, worked hard on ST widgets. So if you've ever tried to use shell widgets and are a little confused, either an extension or the shell itself, there's now a great guide giving examples and how to use them on gjs.guide. Also, a massive shout out to a bunch of other folks who've done small fixes, small examples, tweaks to the documentation, fixing code bugs, and a bunch of other work on the site this year. I could try to read off all those names, but for time and my sanity, I probably will not. I think the coolest one, though, is ByteZ. We don't know their official name. They go by that moniker. And then I think the last community project that we want to shout out right now is Workbench, which is a really great project that has made JavaScript and many other languages in GNOME easy to just jump right into. So you can essentially, if you look behind me, you can write code, you can write styling, you can write UI templating and Blueprint, for example, all in one app, and then you can preview it, run it, and just get going right out of the gates. I want to say that right now, this year, they've added a lot of demos and examples that align with the HIG, introduce people to GNOME concepts, and in general make it easier for new contributors to say, hey, how do I build a GNOME app without, firing up Builder and being overwhelmed with all of these options and languages? This improvements that are specific to us, though, are TypeScript support. So the bindings have made their way into Workbench. So if you're curious about just testing out TypeScript and seeing how it works in GNOME, you can write it right in Workbench. I think the Flatpak has been updated with that version. If it hasn't, look for it online. And you can test out TypeScript without installing anything, monkeying with beta bindings, or anything crazy. A major kudos to Angelo, who worked on that. And I think with that, we're going to transition into what's new in GJS for GNOME 46 and 47. So one really exciting improvement is some console output fixes. So I'm going to butcher some of these names, but I'm going to do my best. So Sriyansh worked on improvements in logging repository namespaces. So if you log like the glib import, for example, it doesn't all explode or show some weird code that you have no idea what it does. It says, hey, you've imported glib. Gary also worked on improvements in logging some of the data structures in JavaScript, which if you haven't used them before, they're things like unsigned integer 8-bit arrays, and also logging things like param specs. So if you're defining GObjects and you want to say, oh, hey, did I define my param spec correctly? You can actually now log those using console.log. And then in general, there are improvements to pretty printing and making console.log, the REPL, and the debugger all work more happily and harmoniously so that we have, a working system that people can easily debug. I want to say, I believe it was NASA that added a lot of the pretty printing work this past cycle. Her work has been amazing in adding pretty printing and also fixing a bunch of issues that we had across. Philip, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, actually a couple of years ago already. We've had it for that long. Yeah. Amazing,
Philip,
isn't it?
I mean, I only added that because you added the speaker note for NASA, Philip, so I was like, oh, was I supposed to shout them out? I guess we have last year's speaker notes in here. That said, 46 and 47 does actually feature some great performance improvements. So Marco, hey Marco, did some amazing performance improvements for setting and getting GObject properties. So now those work faster and better. And there's more improvements to come on that. I believe, Marco, you have several MRs in flight that Philip is diligently working through. So stay tuned for 47 and 48, where GObject properties will get even faster. And then this one is something I worked on and I'm particularly excited to mention. So thanks again to STF Funding for sponsoring this. But we actually have gtk.accessible list in GJS now, which means that you can actually fully define GTK4 accessibility relationships in your apps. Woo! So if you have, for example, a labeled, I think that deserves a clap, yay! Accessibility. So if you have something like labeled by where you have a list of things that are actually labeling it, or if you have a relationship that's like, hey, I have these multiple things related to this or describing this, you can actually do that correctly now. So you just have to call like new gtk.accessible list, pass in the widgets that are part of that list, and then update the relationship in GTK4. I think we're going to work on making this a little bit more ergonomic over time, but you know, it finally works, which is exciting. And this is available in 46, I believe. And then I think the last slide that I'm going to be presenting is an update on async support. So if you remember permissification from earlier, what that is essentially is turning those old async methods that are like, you know, I don't know, read file async, and then you have read file finish. It's taking those and turning them into JavaScript promises, which means you can use the await syntax, which a lot of languages have now, and say like await gio.readfile or something along those lines, without having to do extra work and callbacks and complexity. So right now we have a utility called gio._permissify that if you pass in a specific GIO method, it makes that method capable of using this pattern, but having to explicitly call gio.permissify on everything is a bit confusing and can lead to bugs. For example, you know, in the shell, if an extension developer or a shell developer adds a gio.permissify, suddenly you have a function that sometimes is permissified and maybe sometimes not. So we're working on native support for this. So as of 46, GObject introspection actually now has async annotations. So those GIR or GIR files actually have all the async annotations now in them. So, you know, if your language is ingesting GIR files, for example, the TypeScript bindings, Vala, you can use those to actually figure out how to exactly map functions into their async versions. But now we're adding the runtime support. And so runtime support will mean JavaScript can directly integrate with this and make all async methods work with await syntax and promises in general. So we're expecting this for 47. If you don't know, there's been a pretty big migration of a lot of the GObject introspection code into the glib repository. And so as part of that, a lot of the work around this had to get reshuffled and rebased and fixed and changed to integrate with the glib repository. But I think we've now got the Fedora pipeline passing, and we just have to fix some bugs in that Windows pipeline. And then async support will be merged, hopefully for 47. And again, if I didn't mention it, thanks to STF for funding a bunch of this stuff and making progress. I think at this point, I'm going to transition it over to the amazing Philip, who's going to talk about JavaScript engine upgrades and a host of other exciting topics.
Thanks, amazing Evan, for that introduction. It's, really nice to see you all again and be in this this lovely venue. Also about async support, I want to mention I'm really excited for this because this has been a long time coming. It was also originally the work of two of our outreachy interns from several years ago, and it's
my GSOC year, 2018.
Yeah, it's great to see that we might finally get it over the line this year. So I'm going to switch to the part of the talk where I talk about general improvements to the JavaScript language. You'll see these improvements coming to browsers as well, and we're bringing them to GNOME. So this, I almost always have a section on this, like what we'll get when we upgrade the version of the underlying JavaScript engine to one from a newer Firefox. So this year we're planning to upgrade to the JavaScript engine from Firefox 128. That's their extended support long-term release, and it brings a bunch of new stuff. It used to be like sort of these earth-shaking new syntax things like classes and promises and all that. That's settled down a bit, but still there's a bunch of exciting things. We have a new internationalization facility, Segmenter. Segmenter is a facility that lets you split strings into graphemes, words, or sentences according to the locale rules. So like if you take the Mile High City with a hyphen between mile and high, and you naively split the string on spaces, you're not going to get the correct number of words in it. The string has got 4 words. And different languages have different rules. Like some languages don't use spaces, so if you split on spaces, you're not going to get different words. So if you are building a locale-aware application, this is a useful thing to have. We're going to get group by. This is such a useful thing that many utility libraries in the wider JavaScript world already made their own version of it. Like Lodash had Lodash.groupby. This allows you to partition an array or other iterable into groups depending on the outcome of a mapping function. So we have 2 group bys. We actually have one that'll do it into an object and one that'll do it into a map object, just depending on what you want for your application. We're getting promise.with resolvers. This is kind of a niche one, but it's useful for integrating promises with signal-based APIs. So I have like a code example here of like if you have a WebKit download object and you want to convert that into a promise that you can await when the download is finished. Normally you'd have to connect to the gobject signals, and this code would be a lot more complicated spaghetti if we didn't have promise.with resolvers, because you'd have to like capture the objects in the promise executor callback and blah blah blah. You don't have to do that anymore. This is simpler. We're getting array buffer transfer. This is useful if you're using data buffers and you want to pass them to an async function, and you're afraid that some other code might change them while you're waiting for your async function to return. So the transfer method does a 0 copy ownership takeover. It invalidates all of the old buffers and makes sure that you are the only owner of the new buffer. So here's a little code example where something like this might go wrong. You have async validation of an array buffer, and then when the validation finishes, you want to write it to a file, and then you have this adversarial set timeout down here at the bottom that's going to change your buffer after 5 milliseconds. That's not good. So in your validate and write function, you want to transfer the array buffer, make sure that the set timeout, it doesn't have access to the buffer anymore and can't change it. So there are a couple of things that you'll have to update your code for in this cycle. Most people won't have to update their code, but these are kind of, if you're doing this, then you might need to change. So the first one is new namespaces for platform-specific APIs. Gobject introspection moved into glib, and I think Philip Withnail is going to give a talk on that later in the conference. We got these separate namespaces, glib Unix, GIO Unix, etc. The old namespaces are still going to work for the time being, but you'll get a deprecation message if you're using a platform-specific API, but loading it from the not platform-specific namespace. So things like Unix connection or
Unix pipes.
yeah, Unix pipes. But yeah, that should be fairly straightforward. You'll get a warning, and all you have to do is change the namespace that you import it from. These code snippets on the second line, maybe I should have really devoted a whole slide to this, because it's like this huge pitfall that's existed in GJS for decades. And people write bug reports about it all the time, and until now we've always said, oh no, I'm sorry, but you are actually doing it wrong. But we figured out a way to make to make it less likely for people to make this mistake. So all of the GObjects that we bind in JavaScript, they have constructors that take a property object, or it's sometimes in the JavaScript world called property bag. Like that's the first one here, new GIO file icon, and you pass an argument my file. My file is supposed to be an object with properties, but if you get it confused with the static method new, which also automatically exists because it exists in C, and so we have a binding for it, which takes a GIO file object, and you accidentally pass that to the constructor, you're going to get, it's going to look for properties on that object that aren't there. And that will often lead to incorrectly initialized objects which then later on go on to crash. So we've changed the constructor so that it only accepts a plain object, not a GObject. And you'll get an exception if you try to pass a GObject there. I hope no one was relying on the old behavior. It's possible that maybe you were. If you were, try to migrate your code, but if that's not straightforward, then let us know and we'll revert that change in favor of a longer deprecation period. All right, so the last line on here, many crashes were caused in the past by trying to use C-only APIs from JavaScript, like reference counting and pointer stashing. JavaScript doesn't have pointers, and you don't need to reference count. So for some reason, we'd always left these methods available for you to call and crash your application. I just had to rely on telling people don't do that. These won't work now. We just block them. I'm not sure why we didn't do that before, but these were particularly bad, the reference counting ones, because if you use them, sometimes they would crash, or sometimes they would appear to work, or sometimes they would crash later. So if your code uses them and it appears to work, well, now it definitely won't work, so just delete it. All right, I'm going to also tell about a couple of things that are coming down the line in future JavaScript updates. This is the exciting part, because I also kind of get to talk about what I do in my day job here. I'm a member of the TC39 committee that standardizes the JavaScript language. I do that on behalf of Igalia, and so I've been working on some of these proposals, trying to get them into JavaScript for future browser updates, and I'm excited to present some of these. Here are some things that are already implemented in nightly Firefox, so we'll be getting these next year when we do the next update. We get a bunch of exciting new methods for set objects, like union, intersection, symmetric difference, a bunch of cool stuff. We're going to get resizable array buffers. The transfer thing was already sort of a vanguard of that. It's meant to work with these, but yeah. You'll get buffers that you can grow and shrink. So these we already know are going to be in next year's SpiderMonkey update. There may be other things too, but we'll have to see how, whether Mozilla implements them this year or what they decide to do. Another interesting abbreviation from the JavaScript standardization world is WinterCG. It stands for like Web Interoperability Runtime Community Group. So this is a bunch of non-browser JavaScript runtimes who got together and said, "Hey, let's decide on what we want to say is like a common minimum API for JavaScript environments that's not necessarily, or things that are not officially part of the language, but that everybody kind of relies on, like set timeout and set interval, those like people, and console.log, people expect those to be present. We have them in GJS as well, but they are not officially part of the JavaScript language. They are additional APIs. So this group has been plugging away on this common minimum API proposal that includes things like the ones I mentioned, and also other things like basically B to A, A to B, fetch, things like that. So I'm curious if anybody from our GNOME JavaScript community would be interested in joining this group on GNOME's behalf. Come find me after the talk, and we can talk about that. But this would be really interesting for us, I think, because we are a non-browser JavaScript runtime, and we have actually a pretty unique niche in that we power a desktop rather than a server. There are other exciting proposals coming 2025 or 2026. There's temporal, which I'm this is the thing that I do most of for my job. I gave a talk on it. You can click the link here if you want to know more about it. But I've even seen bugs reported in GNOME Shell that would be solved by using temporal. So I'm excited to see that finally coming to SpiderMonkey, hopefully, and I'm excited to use it in the JS code of the shell. Decorators, we've been eagerly awaiting these for the better part of a decade. I first wrote a blog post on designing a decorator API for GObject classes in July 2017, 7 years ago. And they might be coming next year or the year after. Iterator methods. So if you've written code in Rust or Python, you've probably gotten used to iterators. Like, we do have iterators in JavaScript already, but they don't have as many facilities as they have in other languages, and that's going to be remedied very soon. And then using statements, that's a bit of exciting new syntax in JavaScript. They're kind of like context managers in Python with blocks. They'll be quite useful for explicitly dropping resources that need to be cleaned up, like closing streams and disconnecting signals and stuff like that. That's a bit of a hassle in GJS right now because it's not always clear, like, oh, do you leave it for the garbage collector? Do you clean it up manually? If you rely on it implicitly being cleaned up by the garbage collector, that often runs into problems with callbacks being run during garbage collection. And so using should make this all really simple and streamlined, I hope. There's something coming a bit farther in the future, but that I'd like to highlight because I think it's really exciting, and it could affect the way that we do internationalization in JavaScript apps in GNOME. Like, getText is kind of central to our translation workflow, but xgetText, the tool that extracts the strings from from source code, it has never really integrated well with JavaScript source code. It's just flat out broken for backtick strings. We've tried to fix that, but haven't really been able to. Intel.message format is something that's coming down the standards pipeline in maybe a few years. That is kind of a new, more expressive API for doing this, but also could work as a superset of getText. So we could still consume getText files, but if we need to translate them in JavaScript, we could have a bit more of a JavaScripty API for doing that, and JavaScripty tools. So I think we'd be interested to get a proof of concept of this working with the early stage message format proposal. And so on that note, the section I'm going to run through fairly quickly. I'd like to take the last couple of minutes of the presentation to really boost Intel, because I think we don't use it enough in GNOME. It's it's part of the JavaScript runtime. It does internationalization stuff. We do getText stuff. Intel doesn't do that yet, although it might with message format. But some things are actually awkward to do with gettext. Intel makes those easy. We have all these fantastic facilities in Intel, formatting all kinds of stuff in a way that's appropriate for the user's language. I have like an example actually from GNOME Shell that we ask translators to translate strings like these. How on earth would I know how to translate this into my locale? Well, I don't know. Why don't you just read the manual for strf time? Oh no! So the translator does that, and then you're integrating the work back into GNOME Shell, and you see this. What on earth is this? Now I have to read the manual for strf time. So, like, there's an easier way to do this. It might be longer, it might be a bit more code, but it's less burden on GNOME translators. You create a datetime format object. You say, I want a medium-sized date and a short time in 24-hour clock, and then it just does the right thing for your locale. And you don't need to burden your translators with this. So you might ask, like, well, okay, if the translators aren't giving this data, who is? There's a project called the Common Locale Data Repository that most of the major JavaScript engines get their data from. This work is sponsored by major browser vendors, and it's done by people who take surveys all over the world of people in speaking different languages and in different cultures. So this work is paid for and freely available, and we should take advantage of it. And even if you want to tweak it, you can still do that using format to parts. Like if you don't like that Intel uses a colon as a time separator and you want to change it to a ratio mark because that's typographically more correct, you can do that. All right. So we have somewhere in between 5 and 10 minutes left. So I'm going to throw it to questions. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to GJS or the wider JavaScript community in GNOME, the TypeScript, the Workbench, the GJS.guide, everything. And here's the license for this slide deck. You can reuse bits as is with attribution and not for commercial use. And I like cats.
I think Christian, way in the back.
This is, I guess, more of just a comment quick and a thank you for implementing the parts I needed for libps. For those that want to extend their other applications with GJS and provide like a scripting language, plugin interface, etc., all the new stuff works with libps. It's a very convenient way to manage plugins. It's extremely battle tested. If you think about Builder, it's got hundreds of plugins at this point. It's very easy to come in and write a concise type of plugin. You can use it with GJS now. So if you have another application, you can both consume libps from other languages than C, and you can also extend your APIs using GER, typelibs, etc. With it. And then again, just wanted to say thank you to Philip for doing the hard work that I needed on the C++ bits to make that work.
Thanks.
This is also another comment, more than a question, but the presentation application that I always promised to finish before GUADEC, and I never finished for the past 4 years. It is using libps and GJS, and I can attest it is fantastic. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, that's it.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Actual questions, although I'm not sure how useful they'll be. Is that your cat? What is his name? And does he know he's gorgeous?
Oh, it's not my cat, unfortunately.
Oh.
It's a The image is titled IR cat.
This is the GNOME cat. It's official.
Can we adopt him? Okay, so I'm kind of interested in, I don't really know what my question is, but when you're talking about using Intel as opposed to, the horrible STRF time thing, I think one of the tensions there is Intel is only in JavaScript then, so there's this danger of us having like multiple ways of doing date time. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about that?
I have an answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually have run into this problem a bit in my professional life too, because I work for a mental health company, and we distribute applications in a variety of in languages like Python, some stuff getting into like Rust, etc. And we wanted to essentially stop paying a lot of translators in a lot of languages to translate like date, time, country names, when sometimes it wasn't even correct. Like we would get feedback that was like, oh, this isn't right for my specific region of this country or something. And so we switched to Intel pretty much entirely. What I will say is the CLDR database is completely open, and there's actually a surprising amount of bindings into most languages. So I believe Rust has a library, or actually might have directly integrated it into the language. I'm not totally up to date on that. Python definitely has a CLDR library and also has utilities that built out around that. C, I think, is a bit tricky in that a lot of this is like the core libraries were Java and C++, and then have extended out into JavaScript in other languages. And so C, I think there has been some work. Actually, I think someone may have been working on like a Rust library that exposed a C interface to actually use some of this Intel stuff in C. It's a very burgeoning field. What I'll say is like, it's not just browsers, like your mobile phones, pretty much every like bit of technology you use that is in some way touched often uses CLDR data somehow, somewhere. Like the entire Android localization stack uses bits of CLDR throughout all of it. So I would say like, I think we should be open to exploration, and there's a lot of interesting library work that's happening because this data is generally so much better than what one project can do. And you can reach languages and places that, GNOME has no translations for, but at least we can show them the time correctly, the date correctly, and kind of like the basic functionality of a computer correctly. Do you have anything to add, Philip?
Yeah. I guess, it's a good point that you might have like one piece of code that uses Intel and then another piece of code not in JavaScript that doesn't use it. And if you need those to be consistent, then yeah, I'd say don't use Intel for that. Or try and use one of the bindings for ICU and CLDR in the other language.
To add on to that, what we did at work is we literally have a script that builds like static, files of like date and time translation formatting. So we have consistency across like JavaScript applications and elsewhere. That's not open source, unfortunately, but there is a lot of movement like across, I think, most languages to work on this. I got the 1 minute sign. So do we have a last question?
Thanks, that was really helpful.
Any more questions? Okay, yeah, I think we're good.
We love the Mozilla shirt.
Yeah, I think we're good, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Over to Melissa.